Number 10. Hold the mustard, please. World War I cannot be talked about without talking about the crazy advancements in technology. Seemingly, nations and empires were just itching to try them out on each other. Airplanes, tanks, blimps, machine guns, mostly fairly new and extremely lethal. However, the life of a World War I soldier cannot be talked about without talking about mustard gas or chemical weapons. In 1907, major world players agreed to ban chemical weapons from warfare. So you can understand the confusion by Allied soldiers on the Second Battle of Ypres when over 150 tons of chlorine gas were released. A terrible weapon that would cause trouble breathing, burns, and vomiting. It was so effective that the Allies immediately began working on their own chemical weapons and gas masks to prevent the effects of this supervillain level weapon. I think this quote by World War II General MacArthur sums it up. Whoever said the pen is mightier than the sword obviously never encountered automatic weapons. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. Number 9. All quiet on the Western Front. This is kind of obvious, but people die in war. In World War I, a lot of people died, and a lot of these young men and comrades in arms formed bonds with one another, only to have those friends and brothers be killed and taken away from each other. Over 2 million German soldiers would perish in the First World War, which later would have all kinds of disastrous effects on the country, especially with the rise of Evil Mustache Man. France also lost a similar amount of men. Trench warfare was brutal, and I'll get to that shortly. One of my favorite books and movies, actually, All Quiet on the Western Front, depicts a group of young German boys who are in this thing together, all while having a strong anti-war message, or at least questioning the legitimacy of the First World War. Just make sure when you're in the trenches, no one's handing you those fresh new boots. It's an omen. Number 8. 1-star review. It may come as a surprise to some of you, but living in the trenches on the Western Front wasn't a super fun time. We don't recommend it here at Bumblebee. If you're like me, then you love a good hearty meal. Like my mom always said, I'm a meat and potato kind of guy. That's just how it goes. A nice grilled rare steak, roasted garlic potatoes, and a freshly tossed crisp lettuce Caesar salad. Ooh, that sounds amazing. I'm kind of hungry now. And maybe a beer or two to wash it down. Just a classic meal for a classic guy that I really enjoy. Sadly for the boys in the trenches, this could not have been further from reality. Anyone in the military today with our modern technology will tell you how delicious MRE rations are. But for soldiers of the First World War, rations were limited. And as time went on, especially on the German side, where in 1918 rations were whittled down to turnip soup and turnip bread. Ugh. There were still beer rations. However, and if I'm going to be shot at, I still want a little ale to cure what ails me. You know what I'm saying? Go a long way. Number 7. Trench living. I know after a long day of work, most folks like to kick back and relax. A nice warm house, a cold beer, maybe the game's on. You come home to a family that loves you. The life of a soldier in World War I was more of the horrific variety. Basically, you live in a deep hole that stretches for miles and interconnects with tunnels and other trenches. It's freezing cold in the winter, blistering hot in the summer. Rain's right on top of you, and the mud. Oh, the mud is an issue. Bogged down in a muddy hole, wet freezing with other miserable men who are also wet and freezing. Just not a fun time for anyone involved. I love winter and a good rainstorm here and there, but the difference is I get to come out of the cold after a long day making snow angels or jumping in puddles. The impending doom and being soaking wet would damper anyone's mood. Number 6. Disease in a time of plague. While living in a trench for long periods of time may suck, there's other things besides spooky spiked helmeted Germans waiting to kill you. Bullets, bombs, and artillery are lethal, but you had a very high chance of dying from disease. A lot of these trenches became isolated from supply lines for multiple reasons, and sometimes could be a logistical nightmare, meaning supplies were oftentimes difficult to come by. But no amount of supply could fix the disgusting living conditions of the trenches. Soldiers claimed by the war would often just rot, as recovering fallen comrades was made difficult in trench warfare, making diseases very easy to catch. Besides influenza and typhoid, the most common sickness would be trench foot, or gangrene, where really the only thing to treat it is a trip to the medic's hut with a saw blade to amputate your foot, in which is a pain I cannot even begin to imagine. No thank you. You ever seen 127 Hours? It's kind of the same thing.
Number 5. National flower. While flour was sometimes permitted, flour wasn't encouraged and was one time banned for household use. It was still being allowed commercially for like other cakes and biscuits and stuff. But they had to supply a replacement, so wartime specific products were launched. One was called the National Flour, wheat meal essentially. It was gray in color and had a lot of bran in it. It wasn't as smooth or as soft as flour, so women would desperately like sieve it through their stockings to kind of get like a nice like desired soft texture. Didn't always work. They also used this as a way to feed their chickens without having to spend money on rations. This flour was the key ingredient as to what would be called the national loaf. Nutritionists, funny enough, loved it for some reason because it was like really high in fiber and tried to fight for the bread to be popular post-war, but unfortunately it wasn't very tasty. It sucked. It was often referred to as Hitler's secret weapon because everyone hated it so much. On the upside though, the government was able to keep the supply plentiful enough, so bread was never rationed. Number 4. Spam. Oh, spam. The canned meat people still seem to love. The British tradition for mealtime was to have at least 1 meat and 2 veg. You can guess what stood in for the meat. Spam. The government tried to introduce the Brits to corned beef, an insult. So then they tried something called snowick, which was like a snake mackerel from South Africa. People didn't even like to talk about that one. But then spam came over from the US. It was filling and tasty, just enough to fill that little spot in their tummy. Although it couldn't replace a good steak, it had a long shelf life, and it was perfect for troops in the trenches. Number 3. Pig and chicken clubs. One of the things I love about England or the UK in general is that everyone, even in suburban neighborhoods, have chickens in their backyard. Okay, maybe not everyone, but it's really popular and it's kind of normal. My aunt has always kept them in her backyard since as far back as I can remember. But it wasn't always like that. In the 1940s, commercially farmed hens had to be sold off as food because they didn't have enough to feed them. This led to a massive egg shortage. Only 1 egg was allowed per person per week. Unless you were expecting mother, you were allowed 2. But as a result, people who hadn't kept chickens before this started to in their backyards. You had to give up your egg ration but got to have more grain rations instead. The same thing happened with pigs. Neighborhoods would keep pigs, feed them together, and then share in them. Some would even keep their pigs private, but they had to be registered so you could give up your meat coupons, but some never did. So it was a little bit cheeky. Number 2. Roosevelt coffee. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, some days I really couldn't do this job without coffee. Like I really couldn't. It's a problem. And I'm sure many people feel the same, but sadly for them, back then, coffee was rationed. Pretty much every ounce of coffee was shipped overseas, making coffee impossible to come by in the States. Americans were tasked with drinking less than 1 cup a day. That's like compared to everyone else's 4 cups a day. Introducing Roosevelt coffee. People started making it to help fill in the gap. It was simply reused coffee grounds mixed with ingredients like chicory and postum. It made a kind of watery version of a cup of joe. The chicory added a little spice to it, while postum, a molasses-like substance, added color and flavor, I guess? It wasn't a good time. But last but not least, Hershey's chocolate. The men who took up arms in the trenches faced some of the worst horrors ever imagined. To them, any day, any moment could be their last. A pretty bleak world to live in day in and day out. Morale was crucial to maintain as it could mean the difference between life and death for many soldiers. One way to help support them was food. On June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day invasion. But what you may not know is that an unlikely treat fueled them throughout the mission. Hershey's chocolate bars. Hershey's was approached by the US Army in 1937, way long before the war started, about creating a bar for emergency rations. They had to weigh 4 ounces, be high in energy, withstand high temperatures, and taste a little better than a boiled potato. They didn't want it to be too tasty, otherwise they'd run out. It was called the D ration bar, a blend of chocolate, sugar, cocoa butter, skim milk, and oat flour. And it ended up not tasting too great, but it gave the Allies enough oomph to seize the day.
During the Cold War. Number 10. The Cold War. Some of our viewers may have lived through the times classified as the Cold War, but let me clarify for anyone who doesn't know or was too deep into hippie culture to remember what the heck was going on. And honestly, it's pretty messed up. So in a nutshell, after World War II ended, Germany was split into 2. One side, capitalist allies, the other, communist Soviet Union. Russia was an ally during World War II, but this relationship quickly deteriorated. The two political and economic ideologies would grow distaste for one another, and would compete politically, economically, and most fearfully with their militaries. The United States being the superpower on the one side, and the Soviet Union on the other. They spread their views, a lot of times by force, until almost the entire world was divided by the 2 styles of government, lasting from 1945 all the way up until MTV was still good, around the mid-90s. When the Soviet Union was dissolved. That's a lot of history to unpack here, so I'm gonna do my best to tell you some crazy facts and to make you laugh. I'm a comedian, it's what I do. Number 9. Charlie in the trees. We've talked about Vietnam a few times on this channel, but I can't stress this enough. It was messed up for many people, Americans and Vietnamese alike. As a Canadian, we mostly dodged that hairy situation. While the Vietnam War was America's worst war since World War II, and the most costly in terms of lives and budget, it was not the only conflict. Vietnam was probably the hottest war of the Cold War, but there's many other little things that make this such an interesting time. France had spent years trying to reclaim their colony, and with no luck. America being there for a total legit reason of containment also didn't have much luck, especially after 1968. Refer to our Vietnamese war videos, they're pretty good. Lives lost, lessons learned, and hopefully somebody found Charlie. I swear, in every movie they're always looking for a guy named Charlie. I guess we never find him, I don't know. Number 8. The name's Bond. James Bond. It would be difficult to talk about the Cold War without talking about espionage and spies. While not to the exaggerated level the 007 series likes to take things with its, well, little people and lethal hat throwing, there was still, however, a ton of black ops going on behind the scenes. You only have to look at the superpower spy agencies, the CIA and the KGB. Both agencies went on globe-trotting clandestine operations to gather information, sabotage, and just about anything else James Bond would do. Stealth, spy gadgets, and missions to save the world. All martini shaken, of course, not stirred. Just like Bond, except the whole womanizing thing. Or maybe there was, as the Soviets would often use women's alluring good looks to produce results they so wished for. Ah yes, thanks to beautiful female agents sleeping a lot, thank you, we now know we are one step closer to discovering the Colonel's secret herbs and spices. Our chicken shall have flavor soon. Number 7, Fallout. Probably the heaviest underlying theme of the Cold War was the constant and looming threat of nuclear annihilation. The US got smart in the end of 1945 and developed and used the world's first atomic bombs. This was great for America, not so great for Japan. America was feeling mighty high. That was until the Soviet Union developed their own shortly after. Now it wasn't so cool anymore. Both sides were worried that further escalation of any issue in the Cold War would lead to mutually assured destruction, rendering the bombs the most destructive weapon on Earth and also the most useless. And to be fair, there was a good chance of that happening. There were multiple instances of escalation where the world watched on as the two superpowers were about to end it all. Finna act up because they wanted their politics to be number 1. I'ma act up. Number 6, Space Race. No, the space race is not a race on how many special brownies that you can eat and see how fast it takes you to space out. Remember grade 10, right? I know. What it actually was a race to see who could develop the best and fastest space age technology and advancements. Which, if you study economics, could be a good thing. Healthy competition driven by new technology. In reality, it kinda sucked though. In the 1950s, Russia launched the first satellite, the Sputnik, which to America was scary because it's America. We never lost anything. The Soviet Union would follow up with the first animal in space and then the first man. Some experiments unfortunately never made it back in one piece. America then trumped them back by landing on the moon. Now what's so messed up? Well, for the Soviet Union, this began to put a severe dent in their economy. All the spending on space and military was having an effect on their people. In a nutshell, it made them broke. And if you want to figure out what style of government is better, well, the US has Las Vegas, Russia has beets, and turnips, and depressed artists. Number 5, the Limping Lady. World War II was the cause and effect for a lot of things. If you like spies and espionage, it's kind of where it all started. One of the best spies who did more than her fair share was Virginia Hall, a lady with a peg leg who thwarted German plans again and again, with her sidekick and peg leg nicknamed Cuthbert. She was credited by top German officials as being the most dangerous spy of all time. In one OSS report, her team is credited with destroying 4 bridges, derailing a freight train, and neutralizing 150 enemies, with hundreds more captured. Now, I'm not a world-class detective or anything, but I feel like if you're trying to find the female spy with a peg leg, it isn't that hard, on account of, you know, some pretty specific identifying features. I don't know how you messed that up. Where is the lady? Where is her? And you like hear her walking down the hall. She got a peg leg. What do you mean? Number 4, Miss General. Fuhau was one of 60 wives to Emperor Wu Ding, which I'm not sure even Mormons can figure that out. But to avoid obscuring into the background like TV's least favorite sister wife, she took control. According to records, she led many successful military campaigns and commanded an army of 13,000. While stories of the past can get lost, this is most likely true, as her tomb was full of many different weapons like great axes, which was common to bury distinguished generals with at the time. When I'm buried as a warrior princess, I want my collection of pop figures to come with me. I spent too much time on those bad boys to not take them with me to the afterlife. Number 3. Fatality Tamiris was the queen of Mazagate, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced, a confederation of nomadic tribes that lived east of the Caspian Sea. She ruled during the 6th century BC and is most famous for her vengeful war she waged against the Persian king Cyrus the Great. At first, the war wasn't going too great. Unfortunately, her son claimed his life out of shame for losing in battle. Mom was not happy and promised the bloodiest battle ever. Well, she wasn't lying. As the promised battle was very bloody, many Persians perished in battle, including Cyrus. When his body was recovered, the vengeful queen harnessed the power of mid-90s fighting games and removed his head and turned his skull into a cup and proclaimed, "Drink your fill of blood." Nice. Number 2. The beautiful samurai. What does it mean to be a samurai? Armor, a kick-ass sword, and a code of honor? Yes, it does. And Tomoe Goza did it all and had time to look good doing it. Tomoe Goza's life is shrouded in mystery and many debate her existence, but whatever be the case, she did leave a mark on history. A very red-stained mark on history. Earning the respect of the men around her, it was stated that she had long black hair and a fair complexion and was in command of a large number of men. However, her biggest claim to fame, when she was approached by multiple foes, she rode right at them, grabbing their leader and liberating his head from his shoulders. Wow, you slay it, queen. Number 1. Who else could it go to but the Maid of Orleans? All the badass women who went through a lot on this list, they seen some stuff, honey. But Joan of Arc, girl, she takes the cake. Joan was born a poor peasant but had a unique gift. She could speak to the gods, and the gods told her it was her time to shine. By the time she was 19, she had led thousands of men to battle and in glorious victory. Charles VII, losing the 100 Years' War at the time, said, "Alright, sure, send the girl to fight. What have we got to lose?" Well, they actually had a lot to win. Once Joan had gotten involved, the French began to win victory after victory, and her claims of being guided by God didn't seem so far-fetched after all. The British, being so shaken up by the young girl's military prowess, thought she had been possessed by the devil. The British, not liking losing war to a teenage girl, decided to treat her with compassion by keeping her warm with a fire while she was tied to a wooden post. Joan would later become a legend for her efforts, because getting burned at the stake is honestly a lot and I can't even deal. Number 10. Live long enough to become the villain. Saigon isn't Saigon anymore, and while many great efforts were made to thwart the Viet Cong, the finger quote good guys lost. There's a little bit of irony in the story, however. Think about it for a second. America was a colony who fought a very hard battle for their independence against the most powerful foreign power at the time. Fast forward to the Vietnam War, and here they are trying to fight a war for independence against the most powerful foreign nation. Different in details, but the same in broader terms. Sadly, it was a tragic loss of life on both sides, and while you always want to pick out the hero in every story, in war, it's not exactly black and white. More of a gray area. Number 9. No more heroes. Looking at photos of soldiers coming home from war, you'll see people hugging, cheering, laughing, kissing, and raising a glass to toast the return of their sons and daughters. There's a famous picture from VJ Day that you've probably seen, as a sailor kissing in the streets. However, sadly for Vietnam vets, the return home was not with welcome arms, cheering crowds, or celebrating of any kind, really. The veterans were met with pretty much the opposite. Vietnam was the first war to ever really get the media coverage that it did. For the first time, Americans at home got to see what was going on. And it wasn't pretty. Over time, disapproval for the war grew to the point where it was protested, and soldiers did not receive the care that they needed. As much as we'd like to meme nowadays with Vietnam flashbacks, these soldiers' mental health was not dealt with. PTSD, depression, and a country that didn't want them were very real for shell-shocked men returning home. Number 8. one of many wars. Despite Walter Cronkite and Bob Hope's coverage of the war, and that's kind of a joke for people over the age of 60, Vietnam was a war in a series of armed conflicts during the Cold War. Yes, for Americans it was the most memorable to say the least, but there were many hot wars that took place during the Cold War. I'm not really sure how it got that name, but okay. The Vietnam War was a byproduct of the Cold War, just like these other wars and conflicts. For example, the Ethiopian Civil War, the Ogden War, the Dominican Civil War, the 6 Days War, just to name a few. Vietnam was the last time US forces would fully send troops on the ground like that for at least a few years. All the previous wars I mentioned were more the style of proxy wars. Basically, the United States and Soviet Union would vicariously fight through much smaller, less powerful nations. Basically, it's like getting your big brother to fight for your little brother. Number 7. Rainbow chemicals. Remember the last time when I talked about Agent Orange? Well, there was actually a whole rainbow of colored lethal chemicals used. Orange for trees, Agent Blue to destroy the rice supply, and a few other varieties and colors as well. They became known as the rainbow herbicides. The side effects of these chemicals were horrible, creating birth defects in children whose parents have been exposed. Many people still live with these conditions, and unfortunately, children born today still have birth defects. Clearly this stuff is awful and should never be used again. I went to the chief's lab last night and he took a look at the chemicals and he said, that's not it. Number 6. Ho Chi Minh. The man behind the madness, or at least the communist revolution that he so desperately wanted to take over. Born in 1890 in what was then Indochina, a French colony, his beginnings of being a leader and anti-colonial views started quite young after being expelled from a school for such beliefs. He eventually found his way to France in 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles claimed Vietnamese freedom. His pleas, however, were not heard. A Japanese occupation during World War II and a rise in communism in the East was slowly adding ingredients for a revolution stew. Weird metaphor, but let's run with it. France, wanting to take back their colony, had started the Vietnam War. Now in charge of the communist revolution, it would be a decades-long fight with America and South Vietnam before claiming their bloody victory. Could have been prevented. That's crazy too. Like, he went to France and he's like, give us freedom. They're like, no, sacre bleu, you go back to where you came from. Number 5. The Bataan March. The Bataan March is very similar to the beep test. Or imagine track and field in school, except instead of teachers forcing you to compete in events not designed around your body type, thanks, you're a soldier and the Imperial Japanese Army is making you march miles in the brutal sun. And some people with no shoes on, who often get berated and tormented. Okay, I guess the two aren't very similar at all, but you get the point. All you need to know is that some POWs took a very long walk, and a lot of these POWs, for sure, were not supposed to be treated that way. It was really bad actually. Did not make it to the destination at all. MacArthur said he was coming back after this, and boy did he. Ooh, he came back with a vengeance. Number 4. Veterans. This one is a broad stroke, but I think it fits the bill here. Pretty accurately actually. This goes out to all veterans of the Second World War. Folks at home, you might have to show them this because I can imagine they're a little bit older and probably not too familiar with YouTube, but thank you to all the men and women out there who did their part and paid a bill that I know I never could. The closest I ever want to be to a battlefield is, well, Battlefield, or Call of Duty. From the campaigns in Africa, Italy, France, and pushing all the way into Germany, as well as the brave fighting in the Pacific. I remember, and I for one am very thankful. You don't need to tell me how hard it was to survive or the fight when you came back home. A little wholesome point there. I love that. You guys are great. Thank you very much. Number 3. Bob Hoover. The pilot's pilot. You gotta respect the style of Bob Hoover. Okay, so let's say you spend a year in a German POW camp. You make for your escape, except now what? If it's early 1940s like Bob Hoover found himself in, not a lot of Germanless areas to be in. Well, Bob Hoover knew he needed to say auf Wiedersehen and get the heck out of there. Bob Hoover did not walk, however. No. He did something much cooler. Kind of like when you hijack your first Banshee in Halo 3. Yeah, same thing and same feeling. Bob, being the excellent pilot he was, managed to steal a German plane and flew back to safety, where he linked up with some British allies in the area. How James Bond of you, sir. Oh yes, I love it. Number 2. Ivan Chizov. Another airplane story, but gosh darn, this one is really impressive. Ivan Chizov was a Russian fighter pilot who was having some plane troubles. And by plane troubles, I mean it was going to crash. So yeah, not good. The man knew he had to eject, but the troublesome German planes around him, and the German planes being known for shooting at parachuters, well, he knew he had to make a 5-head play. He said, "I'll just wait till I'm below the ensuing air battle and then I'll pull my parachute." Well, sadly he waited too long and his chute didn't open. He fell 5,000 meters to the ground and lived. He lived. Poor Ivan did sustain some serious injuries, but like a miracle got the medical attention he needed and asked to join back in the fight only 3 months later. That's just kinda crazy. 5,000 meters and he lived? How? Number 1, German summer camp. I promise it's not going where you think it's going. The international community had an idea of what Germany was up to during the years before World War II, but no one really knew for sure. When Allies moved into occupied Europe, it was clear some people were gonna have some explaining to do, okay? You can't do this, guy. You can't do that, man. You can't do that. But you guys knew that. It was awful and should never happen again. You guys know what I'm talking about. However, today the worst camp I want to talk about is their youth program. Mustache Man was trying to build a better Germany. If he started with the youngins, the camp was designed like many today to give young folks something to do, to educate them, keep them occupied, or in my mom's case, some peace and quiet during the summer. Well, at this camp it wasn't bonfires and swimming, it was all kinds of nasty things YouTube probably won't let me say. But what I can tell you is that it was a brainwashing effort to get everyone in support of their not so glorious leader.
Number 10, rationing. So I think it's important to begin this list by talking about rationing. Lots of food was sent away to help the soldiers going off to fight in the war. That means that each person only had a certain amount of coupons that they were allowed to use to buy things like eggs, sugar, flour, etc. There were less shipments coming from other companies due to the threat of U-boat attacks, so food became really expensive and people panicked, rushing to stores to stock up. In 1918, the government decided to introduce rationing so as to develop a way to share food fairly. That way grocery stores didn't face a ridiculous shortage of toilet paper. Even the King and Queen of England had ration cards, and the cards could only be used at certain shops. If you were caught stealing or cheating, then you could be fined or even thrown into prison. Fortunately, nobody starved, but people were often left hungrier than usual. To aid with that missing spot in their tummy, people began cultivating their own gardens, and preserved jams, pickles, and chutneys became really popular. Number 9. Vegetarian chopped liver. So with rations and war being introduced, people had to get used to a whole different way of life. If they were craving one of their favorites for dinner, they had to get inventive. Hence, vegetarian chopped liver. It won't surprise you to learn that during World War II, a lot of Jewish families in occupied territories were advised to stretch their food rations very thin, which often meant filling in a recipe with something a lot cheaper. Chopped liver was a staple dish, so to find a way to fill the gap, they created a vegetarian version. They found a way to make it, kind of, using fresh fruits, vegetables, meat was swapped out for green beans, peas, onions, hard-boiled eggs, if possible, and crackers. Number 8. Mock goose. So the war is on, rations are in play, but Christmas is still coming, and hey guys, it's Thanksgiving this weekend too. Happy Thanksgiving, Americans. What on earth was going to take the place of a delicious roast Christmas goose? Well, I introduced to you mock goose. I'm just realizing that World War eras were actually pretty vegetarian friendly, because no one could really afford meat. Mock goose was a combination of sliced potatoes, apples, cheese, sage, vegetable stock, and a teaspoon of flour. They would place a layer of sliced potatoes, then apples, sage, seasoning, cheese, and then repeat. Basically a potato, apple, and cheese lasagna. I'm glad they didn't try to make it look like a goose because it's almost worse eating something that doesn't taste what it looks like, you know? Number 7. War cake. Though the recipe was printed in the Second World War, it also made the rounds in World War I. People weren't going to stop craving delicious tea cakes and sweets just because of the war. If anything, it made them crave it more. But they had to make do with what they had. Recipes like this one often appeared in women's magazines, as food conservation was seen as a way women contributed to the war effort. Canadian war cake goes as follows, and though the ingredients don't seem that odd, the making was a bit strange. It includes 2 cups of sugar, 2 cups of hot water, 3 tablespoons of lard or a fat, 1 teaspoon of salt, cloves, cinnamon, seedless raisins, not a raisin fan. This would then all be boiled together and then cooled. They would boil that together. I've never actually read a recipe like that at all. Then 4 cups of flour would be added and a tablespoon of soda and baking powder. The consistency of the cake was closer to that of a dense spread, but when you've got to take it day by day, it was a small joy. Number 6. The potato pasty. Potatoes! I love potatoes. Easy to grow, versatile, tasty, potatoes became the go-to saviors of many a recipe. The British government even handed out leaflets encouraging people to get inventive with the potato. There were recipes from the normal baked potatoes, biscuits, and even something called a potato piglet, which was supposed to substitute, somehow, a sausage roll. But then of course there was the potato pasty. It was a pie pastry which contained margarine or a fat was also really hard to come by, flour, potato, and salt. They had to eat it as soon as it was hot, as it had a tendency to dry up once it cooled down. They also used potatoes in general with other recipes to make them more filling.
Number 5. Hijikata Toshizal. Back to the Shinsengumi. Hijikata joined the Shinsengumi alongside Kondo, where he rose his way to the title of Vice Commander. He was famed for rooting out corruption within his organization, and his dedication to the role was so great that he refused marriage on the pretense of how dangerous it would be for his wife. Keeping the group in line, they would join the Boshin War. During Kondo's capture, Hijikata would attempt to appeal Kondo's innocence, but was repeatedly denied. Fearing the collapse of the Tokugawa, Hijikata led one final raid to steal the warship Kotetsu, where the swordsmen were repelled by the ship's crew and a Gatling gun. Driven to Hakodate, before the closing of the war, he instructed his page to dedicate a poem of his death. Though my body may decay on the island of Ezo, my spirit guards my lord in the east. He was later killed, shot while riding on horseback. The Shinsengumi surrendered and was disbanded. Number 4. Tomoe Goza. Another warrior active during the late Heian period, Tomoe was one of Japanese history's few women warriors. She served under Yoshinaka, leading 300 samurai to victory against 200 Taira warriors in 1182. Clashing with Yoritomo, they lost the battle, Yoshinaka sending Tomoe away while claiming that he'd be ashamed to die with a woman. Smooth. From there, accounts and details become muddy. Apparently she just went on a rampage, killing at least 3 major samurai before escaping. One story goes that she was captured and made to wed the soldier Wada Yoshimori, and after his death in 1213, she made her way to a temple and became a monk, living until 91. Other stories claim that she committed seppuku, and more stories yet claim that she took her lord's head, walking into the sea with it to serve him in the afterlife. Any of these could be true, and personally I think the last one is really metal, so that'd be my headcanon. Number 3. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. We're getting into the big boys here. Originally beginning his career under Nobunaga, Hideyoshi would avenge his lord and assume authority. Constructing Osaka Castle, Hideyoshi would then engage in a series of campaigns against the Katsui and Ieyasu clans, creating the clan of Toyotomi. From there, he would campaign in an attempt to unify Japan, conquering Nagoroji, Shikoku, Toyama, Kyushu, and Odawara, which ended the Sengoku period. He'd also ban the peasantry from owning weapons to prevent revolts, creating a statue of Buddha from the melted remnants. He would then attempt to campaign against Korea with pretty poor results. One of his more famous acts was the perpetration of the 26 Martyrs, where 26 Christians were arrested and tortured, then crucified in Nagasaki. He'd try to war with Korea again and would achieve some victories, but it would ultimately fail. Hideyoshi passed away in 1598. This would mark the beginning of Tokugawa's prohibition of expansionist attempts until the 19th century. Number 2. Oda Nobunaga. The biggest and baddest of the boys. Oda Nobunaga was born into power, but once his father passed, the clan began to dissolve into a succession crisis. He would wrangle power from his relatives, consolidating the clan not a moment too soon, as their longtime rival Imagawa was ready to invade. Leading an army of roughly 2,000 men against 25,000, Nobunaga aggressively battled his rivals, gaining allies and territory through frankly genius strategic calls that led the small territory to sudden and crushing victories. He would then lead a campaign to unify Japan, a massive series of wars that began the Sengoku period. His exploits are far too many for just this one point, and in 1882 he would be betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide, who would then take the life of Nobunaga's son and force Nobunaga to commit seppuku. Number 1. Miyamoto Musashi. Swordsman, philosopher, writer, ronin. These and many more titles are attributed to the famed warrior Miyamoto Musashi, the wandering swordsman whose exploits are detailed in the self-published Book of the Five Rings. The legends and exploits of this man are legendary, from his first duel to his fight with Sasaki Kojiro, and once more, what is fact and what is fiction can be heavily debated. He was also famed for his peculiar style of combat, using one sword in each hand, a katana and a wakizashi, or sometimes a jute, a sword parrying tool. He claimed that his arms could move more naturally that way, but it also just could have been the rule of cool. Musashi's greatest achievement may have simply just been passing away peacefully in his 60s. His fame has long since lasted in media, most famous being the manga series Vagabond.
Number 10. Queen of the Red Sails. In history, when men drop the ball, there's always an iron-willed woman to pick up the slack. Not because a man is telling her to, but because she wants to. How about inheriting a whole pirate fleet from your late husband? Meet Zhang Yisao. Her husband had managed to build quite the little nautical empire, and with his untimely passing, she became the boss. She commanded a fleet of over 400 ships, and estimated between 20 to 60,000 pirates at her peak. She's noted for organizing and uniting pirates into a confederation. She also had some imperial entanglements, having entered conflict with the East India Company and the Portuguese Empire. This is a lot to go through, especially when I get anxiety from being left alone at the cashier at the grocery store. Number 9. Double Trouble. The Trung sisters from Vietnam are still celebrated today, because honey, they went through a lot. The sisters led the first resistance against Chinese dominance, which at the time had lasted over 247 years. Many believe Vietnam wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for their efforts, gathering 80,000 people to join their cause, once killing a tiger and writing a proclamation of war on its hide. They managed to hold off the Chinese forces for 3 years before finally being overtaken. The Trung sisters are a great deal of national pride and pride amongst many women in Vietnam. Sadly, the Chinese proved too strong. But to prevent capture, the sisters later drowned in a last fit of defiance. Number 8. Hell hath no fury. The Roman Empire was just about good at everything. Politics, culture, building a city that would stand the test of time, and eventually outlive their civilization. But perhaps the Romans' strongest attribute was their military. I mean, come on, it's Rome, no introduction is needed here. So when a man was worried that the Romans he had worked with might take over his homeland after he had passed, he left a note in his will saying, "Please do not take this. This is mine, don't take it." I'll give the folks at home a second to think about what the Romans did next. If you guessed annex his homeland and do non-YouTube friendly conduct things to his wife and daughter, you'd be correct. His wife Boudicca, not feeling so cool about what happened, took some action by gathering the tribe together and revolting against the Romans. Defeating the scrambled Romans in a battle, she then made her way to Londinium, or what's now London, and had it burned. There were empires that couldn't take down the Roman Empire, and Boudicca did it like it was nothing. They did end up losing, and once again to avoid capture drank poison. But come on, she took down the Romans. Number 7. Viva la Revolucion. Juana de Paria was born in Spanish-controlled Peru to 2 loving parents. Like many classic stories, her mother sadly passed away when she was young, where she grew very attached to her father. Although unusual for the time, her father instructed her on how to horse ride and sharpshoot. Even helped her father work during the days. They were pretty tight, but like an M. Night Shyamalan movie, there's a double twist. Her father passed away in her teens. Now an orphan, she was forced to move in with her aunt, where she quite possibly developed the very first feelings of teenage angst before there was ever an Avril Lavigne album. Juana would often have outbursts that got her eventually sent to become a nun, where that also did not go very well. During her studies, she was fond of Joan of Arc, but eventually she was expelled at the young age of 17. After years of witnessing colonial reign, she joined the revolution. She became so passionate about the cause, she once fought a battle while pregnant, went back to have a baby, and then went back to battle with the baby strapped to her back. Man, sometimes I don't even want to get up after a large meal. What a woman! Number 6. Not one step back. Ludmila Pavlichenko was just like any other girl in Russia in the 1940s. She was in her last year of university when history's favorite mustache man invaded history's second favorite mustache man. Feeling inspired by her country's call to arms, she signed up for military service. She would eventually find her way to be a sharpshooter. During the siege of Odessa, she is credited with 187 confirmed kills. She married a fellow sniper, he died, then she went on to have over 300 confirmed kills when the war was over. Once the military realized how valuable she was pulled from the front lines, where she became key propaganda for Russia. She would also find herself training young snipers up until the end of the war. She was oftentimes referred to as the Lady of Death.
Number 5. Lozan. Lozan was a Chichihene Chiricahua Apache combatant who fought for the freedom of her people from the San Carlos Reserve in Arizona. Operating under the command of her brother Victorio, Lozan was famed for leading refugees across the Rio Grande and guiding a mother and child across the Chihuahuan Desert, supposedly even taking down a longhorn with just a knife to silently acquire supplies. Returning to the front, Lozan was eventually captured, passing away as a prisoner of war, but her tale lives on as a legendary warrior. Number 4. Boudicca. Upon the death of Iceni king Prasutagus, he issued a will that proclaimed both of his daughters and the Emperor Nero to be his heirs. His will was ignored by the Romans, and the kingdom was subsumed by the Britannian province, Roman soldiers sent to ensure its delivery into Nero's hands. What happened from there was an utterly vile razing of Iceni lands. Prasutagus' wife Boudicca and his daughters were tortured, and their people massacred. Boudicca, incensed with the desperation of revenge, organized an uprising and led an army of Iceni warriors to regain their liberty. They responded to the brutalities committed against them in kind, ensuring that even if they did not win, then the Romans would at least understand the grave error they'd made in taking their land. Number 3. Fuhau. One of the strongest generals in Chinese history, Fuhau worked as both a priest and a warrior. She married into Wu Ding's household and worked her way up the ranks, making her way to the position of second queen. From there, she engaged in military activities and rituals, overseeing numerous campaigns in the name of the Shang dynasty. She is also credited with the earliest known usage of the ambush tactic in Chinese history. While exceptional from current knowledge of this period, it should be noted that the Shang dynasty frequently employed women as soldiers within their armies. Even so, her achievements were so great that on her passing, Fuhau was buried with 130 weapons, along with several human sacrifices and a massive amount of jade and other assorted objects. Number 2. Zenobia. One of the greatest Syrian rulers, Septima Zenobia rose to power through marrying King Odenathus, who was assassinated by the jealous Maeonius, who lasted as emperor for all of about 5 minutes before being killed by his own soldiers. Though her son was set to rule, he was also, 10, so Zenobia was made the regent. Consolidating power, Zenobia began to expand her borders eastward, her regency slowly turning into just plain out old rule. Declaring her son to be the emperor, she became the de facto empress, and continued to rule. Beloved by her people, she made the kingdom a place of learning and religious tolerance, striving to make sure that the multiple peoples under her rule were treated fairly and well. While she initially attempted to avoid conflict with Rome, they did clash after the whole, she became an empress thing. The result did end up in Zenobia's loss, and she was captured by the Romans, who apparently spared her, and accounts from what happened then are sketchy at best. We may not know what exactly happened, but the empire she made was certainly one to remember. Number 1. Ana Nzinga. Queen of the Mbundu kingdoms in the land of Angola, Nzinga initially began her career in politics as an ambassador to the Portuguese, whom the Mbundu were constantly at war with. When her father passed, her brother Mbandi came to power, attempting to consolidate his strength and continue warring with the Portuguese. He used his sister as a diplomat to attempt for peace. However, the Portuguese demeaned and belittled her, furnishing their rooms with chairs for themselves and a floor mat for her. Undaunted, Nzinga had her attendant form her chair and spoke with the diplomats eye to eye, securing a peace treaty. This was short-lived, however, and Mbandi eventually had to abdicate the throne to her. From there, she led a war against the Portuguese and the Mbangalans, taking the Matamba lands and growing her forces through a mixture of carefully plotted and ingenious exploitations of cultural rules and rights. She warred with Portugal for 25 years, wearing down their forces until peace talks began, aided by the Portuguese stirring conflict with Spain. Nzinga would then begin to tentatively integrate Christianity into her kingdom, and strove to ensure that no wars of succession would occur after her passing.
Number 10. Japanese Holdouts. September 2nd, 1945, World War II had come to an end as the Japanese forces officially surrendered. Well, that's awesome, right? Time to go on vacation, honey. Say, those Pacific Islands look beautiful this time of year. Well, especially when we're not being shot at. They look a lot better then. Sounds great, right? I know. Well, I'd be careful where you go, as when night falls on the islands, you can never be too sure what lurks in the brush. That includes soldiers of the Japanese Empire still fighting World War II on their own terms. That's right, Japan went on the defensive after the Battle of Midway during World War II, occupying every island in the Pacific to slow down the Allies. Now, you mix in being dug into those islands for years with an unrelenting dedication to the Emperor, thank you very much, and you got yourself some soldiers who just won't quit. Years after World War II ended, a handful of dudes who would finally come to realize that it was all over finally surrendered. However, some soldiers stayed in hiding for up to almost 30 years. They thought they were fighting World War II for 30 years. That is insane. Number 9. Mad Jack Churchill. With the way Hollywood works, I'm more surprised this guy hasn't gotten a movie made about him. Seriously, look this guy up, you won't believe it. However, what I can say is I'm glad he was on our side, and I am very sure of that. Mad Jack Churchill was a British commando who was more known for his use of medieval tactics, well, because he liked to use a longbow and a broadsword for battle, which I can't even tell you how messed up that is. I can only imagine the fear in the Germans' eyes when a man cometh marching over a hill, playing Scotland the Brave, wielding a broadsword and charging at full speed. Jack was captured, escaped, captured again, and after he and some other POWs dug their way out of a prison, he then walked hundreds of miles to the Allies in Italy. That's just a crazy story. Where is that man's story? And coming over to playing Scotland the Brave, that's crazy, man. That's insane. I like that though. I like that song. That's a good song choice if I've ever heard that. Number 8. Desmond DOSS. Besides having a name that really sounds cool, Desmond is a man with a unique experience. When you think of war, it's guy with gun go boom, right? Makes sense, sure. Well, not according to Desmond. He walked into battle as a combat medic without a firearm. Yes, nothing to defend himself with. I know, he's crazy, right? I know. Crazy enough to earn himself the Medal of Honor, which usually isn't earned whilst you're still alive. Usually earned after you don't make it. His valor was proven in Okinawa and Hacksaw Ridge, good movie, go see it, where he helped carry injured men back from the line and literally saved their lives, all while under the threat of enemy attack and sharpshooters. Over his life-saving career, he would save up to 100 lives, and a few more. He even saved some enemy lives. A shining light in pure darkness. Number 7. Second Son. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is a very lucky man. Folks, after hearing about this one, I would go and buy a lottery ticket. Seriously. You may win after this, pretty lucky. Okay, so Mr. Yamaguchi was on a business trip in Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. He was set to return to his home in Nagasaki when an American B-52 bomber dropped its payload on the city. And this was the big bad one. Miraculously, Mr. Yamaguchi, after being blown off his feet and receiving cuts and radiation burns, was still alive. He rested at a shelter and then returned home. On August 9th, he was explaining what had happened to him 3 days prior when another large flash of light and explosion went off. This was the other big one. It left him deaf in one ear, but he was further away from ground zero the second time. But yes, this is a man who survived both atomic devices. He lived all the way up until his 90s. Very impressive. Number 6. Escaping to South America. This is one of the reasons I have an issue with the Disney Star Wars movies. Hang in there, trust me. After Darth Vader destroys the Sith with the love of his son and the Emperor takes a dive into the exploding Death Star 2 reactor, oh no, not another dive in the reactor, most people think it's all over. But what about the countless other Imperials, thousands of stormtroopers and Star Destroyers? For the Disney movie, they pretty much just updated the look and said, yeah, they're back. They're back now. But I need more details, baby. Speaking of details, How did high-ranking Germans escape to South America after World War II ended? Yes, thought-provoking, isn't it? Well, that's right, they did. The answer, though, is a network of rat lines. Germany 1945 had an issue. If you look to your left, there was a coalition force of armies coming their way, singing Yankee Doodle Dandy all the way to Berlin. On their right was an army bent on revenge, singing a much more heinous version of Yankee Doodle Dandy all the way to Berlin. So the Germans grabbed their schnitzel and sauerkraut to go and de-assed the area. Trouble is, the guys who were escaping were the worst of the worst. We weren't talking about any grandpas or opas here. These guys are pretty bad. One's responsible for very horrible things. Some were caught, but sadly, others were not. Josef Mengele comes to mind. Google him. Not nice.
In 5th place, we have an airman who crashed and survived. Nicholas Alcamaide was born in 1922 in Norfolk, England, and was a gardener before signing up with the Royal Air Force when the Second World War broke out. He was part of a crew that flew an Avro Lancaster Mk2, which often flew night missions, and as such was christened Werewolf. Kinda funny. Nicholas flew 14 successful missions with the crew of Werewolf, and on the night of March 24th of 1944, they were part of a raid targeting Berlin. They managed to successfully deliver their payload, but on the return journey, heavy winds took them off course. They wound up flying over the Ruhr region, which had a high concentration of anti-aircraft defenses. Werewolf was attacked from below by a German night fighter aircraft, and the resulting damage tore up Werewolf's wing and fuselage, setting the plane on fire. It's kind of obvious that the Werewolf was beyond salvation, and the pilot ordered the crew to get the heck out. Now Nicholas, alone in his turret at the very back of the plane, was already being scorched by the flames, with his rubber oxygen mask beginning to melt to his face, and his arms were completely seared by the fire, so he was scrambling for his parachute pack and discovered that it was already on fire. Nicholas was now facing a fun dilemma. Either burn to death or take his chances and jump without a parachute. Well, he jumped from the burning plane, lost consciousness, and miraculously woke up 3 hours later, lying deep in the snow in a pine forest. It seemed that the flexible pine trees had slowed his descent enough that the snow was able to cushion his fall. He had not broken any bones, but had managed to sprain his knee after, his 18,000-foot fall from the sky. In addition, he suffered burn wounds from the fire and had pieces of perspex from his flak-shattered screen embedded in his skin. That's a dang miracle if I've ever seen one. He began blowing his distress whistle, which eventually attracted the attention of some German civilians. Nicholas was taken to a nearby hospital where his wounds were treated, and when he was well enough to talk, he was interrogated by the Gestapo. Even after they proved his story was true, and he wasn't a spy, he was sent to the notorious prison camp Stalag Luft III. Nicholas's luck remained with him though. When the camp's 10,000 inmates were forced to trek hundreds of miles across northern Germany through a blizzard with temperatures dropping as low as -22, he survived and was eventually liberated. As my grandpa would say, he was born with a horseshoe up his... Come on, can't I at least say that word? No? Alrighty, up to you folks to finish that sentence. In 4th place, we have explosive devices that are still being found. For context, between 1940 and 1945, US and British Air Forces dropped 2.7 million tons of kabooms on Europe and half that amount on Germany. Under Allied occupation in 1945, reconstruction of what had been destroyed began almost immediately. Yet as many as 10% of the explosives dropped by Allied aircrafts had failed to explode, and as East and West Germany rose from the ruins, thousands of tons of unexploded airborne ordnance lay beneath them. In both the East and the West, responsibility for defusing these devices, along with removing the innumerable hand grenades, bullets, and mortar and artillery shells left behind at the end of the war, fell to specialty police technicians and firefighters known as the KMBD. Y'all don't want to know how many times I tried to say the long form and just, with my brain, it not happening. Sorry. More than 2,000 tons of unexploded munitions are uncovered on German soil every year. Before any construction project begins in Germany, from simply the extension of a home to track laying by the National Railroad Authority, the ground must be certified as cleared of unexploded ordnance. Oh, someone out there finds this far-fetched. Okay. In November of 2013, 20,000 people in Dortmund were evacuated while experts defused a 4,000-pound blockbuster device that could destroy, most of a city block. Specialists discover more than 500 tons of unexploded munitions every year and defuse an aerial device every 2 weeks or so. Did that make your doubts go away? Had a feeling it might. In 3rd place, we have the Museum of a Forgotten Race. After winning the war and achieving their overarching goal of wiping out the Jewish people in Europe, the Nazis originally intended to open a museum that would commit a second genocide and depict the Jews as a people who had to be exterminated because they were a decadent and parasitical race, which is allegedly why the Yazis were holding on to a centuries-old collection of Jewish artifacts in Prague. Over 85 Jewish people had their lives ended at the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp in France to serve as part of an initiative of Yazi anthropologists and doctors to dissect and display their bodies in a museum collection dedicated to the supposed inferiority of the eventual extinct race of Jewish people. Modern anthropologists have discovered collections of limbs stored with the intention of being displayed and cataloged. Thank goodness this never came to fruition. In second place, we have some uses for hair and human ashes. It's no secret what went on at concentration camps, with tales of the gas chambers being way too many. Something that doesn't get touched on as much was that when the gas cleared, groups of inmates would shift the corpses, pull out any gold teeth, and shave hair. These men, known as Sonderkommando, were better fed and worked at their grisly tasks for 3 to 4 months before meeting their own end, since they knew too much. The hair was stored in a room above furnaces to keep it warm in the piercing cold of any Polish winter. No such luxury was permitted for the camp's inhabitants, but the hair was worth something, around half a mark a kilo. The textile industry used human hair to line socks and gloves for submarine and railway workers and make thermal blankets. I guess there's kind of like a grim efficiency about it. The human ash from furnaces was stored in 4 purpose-built pits, which remain today, from where it was taken to be spread on local farmers' fields to help with the crops. In first place, we have the experiments of Dr. Joseph Mengele. Also known as the Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph was an anthropologist and SS physician who conducted numerous inhumane medical experiments on the prisoners in Auschwitz. He was particularly interested in twins, as twin research was seen at the time to be the ideal way to determine how the environment or human heredity could influence the human body. He would attempt red fluid transfusions from one twin to another, do amputations to try and sew it on the other twin, stitch 2 twins together to form Siamese twins, infect 1 twin with any kind of disease, and too many other experiments. To the surprise of no one, more often than not, the twins died during the procedures, or he would have them killed afterwards just so he could do an autopsy. If one twin died from disease, he would often end the life of the other as well, to, study the differences between these sick and healthy subjects. The evil doctor was also very interested in heterochromia, where people have irises of different colors, and he would collect eyes and body parts of his victims and send it through for research? He would inject chemicals in victims' eyes to attempt to change their eye color. He also experimented on pregnant women before sending them off to the gas chambers and caused incestuous pregnancies, always under the guise of, research. Oh, and operating on victims without anesthesia. Oh, and if that wasn't, disgusting enough, he tried to prove that Jewish and Romani people were genetically inferior through his morbid experimentation.
Number 10. Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Born to the Minamoto clan, just as the Heian period was falling apart, Yoshitsune escaped the murder of his father and brothers during the Heiji Rebellion. He'd be placed in the care of monks at Kurama Temple, where he'd learned to use a sword and, more importantly, his mind. Leaving the temple, the stories of Yoshitsune drift between fact and fiction, some works of art depicting him defeating a bandit by the name of Kumasaka at the age of 15. What is held as truth is his friendship with Benkei, a warrior monk who was defeated by Yoshitsune in a friendly duel. The two would then join the Genpei War, Yoshitsune joining his brother Yoritomo, who had become head of the clan. After the war, his brother would become jealous of him, causing Yoshitsune to flee Kyoto until he was cornered and forced to fight Benkei. Supposedly, he was pressured into committing seppuku, though there is some debate on this, as the Ainu, the Japanese long-maligned indigenous peoples, hold a historical account of Yoshitsune escaping to Hokkaido. Number 9. Kunisoki Masahige. Active in the Kamakura period, Kunisoki was known for his contributions to the Kenmu Restoration in 1333. While his origins are generally unclear, it's agreed upon that he was a member of the gentry before his rise to fame. His career was spent mostly in the service of Emperor Go-Daigo in a war to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate, with the end goal of returning power to the rule of the emperor. Despite Kunisoki's tactical brilliance, Go-Daigo was kind of stupid, and a tactical error during a crucial battle led to Kunisoki's demise. His famous last words were, "Would that I had 7 lives to give for my country." Fittingly, he currently has 2 wickedly cool statues, one in front of the temple Kashinji, and the other in front of the current Japanese Imperial Palace. Number 8. Kondo Isami. A member of the Shinsengumi, Kondo Asami started life as a relatively well-known scholar and exceptional swordsman. He then rose to fame after a gang of thieves broke into his family home, which he supposedly defeated single-handedly. From there, he was trained as a swordsman, but wouldn't see action until the establishment of the Shinsengumi, where he was established as a teacher of swordsmanship and eventually made a full member. From there, he was embroiled in the conflict born from the dissolution of the Tokugawa shogunate, and while the Shinsengumi were disbanded, at that point he managed to retain a similar rank and title. From there, he was essentially forced on the back foot, and in 1868 Kondo was captured and executed under the pretense of having murdered Sakamoto Ryoma. Number 7. Sakamoto Ryoma. Mastering the sword at a young age, Sakamoto worked as a teacher of kenjutsu until the political situation in Japan took a turn for the worse. Sakamoto joined a number of anti-shogunate forces, and is credited with a number of assassination attempts, some of which did succeed, though he was known as someone who generally believed that the shogun should serve the people. He would later be assassinated by a group of attackers, who slaughtered Sakamoto and his friend Nakaoka Shintaro. The Shinsengumi was accused of the murder, leading to Kondo Asami's execution. A pro-shogun group called Miwari Gumi would confess to the murder 3 years later, but the true assassin was never found. Sakamoto's gained fame as something of a Clint Eastwood-style character in modern fiction ever since. Number 6. Yasuke. While Japan was famed for its isolation, there were many ports in which trade did occur. One of these trades was the slave trade, where Nobunaga happened upon a man who would have been extremely peculiar to his eyes. Yasuke's exact origins are unknown, but as most of the slaves traded in the area were originally from Mozambique, it's generally a solid theory that he'd have come from there, specifically the people of Yao, though others claim that Sudan and Ethiopia could have served as his homeland just as well. Either way, Nobunaga was introduced to Yasuke, originally thinking that his skin must have been painted. Accompanying a missionary, Yasuke learned Japanese and eventually became a retainer of Nobunaga, becoming the warlord's weapon bearer. We'll get more into Nobunaga later, but Yasuke was known to have been with him at the end of the warlord's life. Beyond that, Yasuke's fate is unknown, as the traitor Akechi did not kill him for quoted reasons that are gross and kind of racist, and I will not say because ew.
Number 5 of Rats and Men. The trenches were a messed up place to be for a human being. Seriously, I can't recommend it to anyone. But for a small rodent creature like a rat, it may as well be Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas. As a rat, you had access to food scraps, shelter, and everything a growing rat needs. They breed like crazy and had become commonplace amongst the soldiers and decaying bodies sinking in the hellish mud. The rats grew bigger and bolder, with some cases of rats stealing food right out of soldiers' hands. Sometimes there was so many that soldiers had to essentially hunt them in order to cull the numbers, as there was no system for removing them entirely. On a brighter note though, some soldiers kept them as pets to keep their minds off the impending doom of World War I and trench combat, so you know what, that's kind of cool, a little rat friend. I'll call him Ralph, I don't know why, Ralph's a cool name. Number 4, No Man's Land. This is what all the chaos is about. The part most soldiers quivering in their boots fear. Maybe it's better to stay with the rats and corpses than freeze. Most soldiers are waiting for one sound. That means 2 things. A whistle blowing means you're going over the top, or the enemy is coming to you. Either way, someone is going to have to cross No Man's Land, which is the space between 2 opposing trenches defended on either side with barbed wire, mines, and machine guns, waiting to cut down the enemy charging at full speed. No Man's Land earns its grim nickname as the bodies that fall out there will stay there and become a part of the battlefield. Rolling artillery barrages were meant to aid soldiers in crossing No Man's Land, but no amount of help, liquid courage, or any other factor could really prepare you for that first leap of faith, climbing over the top and facing the enemy. Number 3, Humanity. While a lot of soldiers met their demise to the new inventions of the war like chemical weapons and improved artillery, trench warfare brought out the worst in humanity. The idea of going over the top was to take the enemy trench. Doing so would move the front line up. A war of inches, if you will. However, you cannot take the enemy trench if the enemy is still there. And that is where the bayonets come in, gentlemen. Horrific as it may be, once you made it into the trenches, the warfare looked more like Stone Age fighting than modern. Swords, knives, rifles in close range, clubs, mallets, and homemade blunt objects, and sometimes fists, were used in an intimate setting of a muddy trench just to kill each other, often being some of the most brutal and intense fighting of the war. Even after all that, Taking the trench was difficult, but defending it was more, as oftentimes armies went back and forth trying to break enemy lines in between trenches. No thanks. Number 2, sharks with frickin' laser beams. Okay, I know the title's a little misleading, but hear me out. Airplanes and aviation had only been invented a few years prior, or at least a modernized version of them. So humans gained the ability to fly, something people of the past could only dream of. So what's the first thing humans do to this amazing revolutionary invention? Can we weaponize this? Yeah, it's kind of messed up to think about, but when we gained the ability to fly, one of the first real uses we used it for was to destroy each other. Airplanes did play a crucial role in World War I, but not just for ace pilots like the Red Baron, but for reconnaissance. At least the tank was designed for military application. Leave it up to us to strap an automatic weapon and bombs to one of the greatest gifts ever given to mankind. And the sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their frickin' heads are the same energy. I think so, at least. Number 1. Merry Christmas. This would honestly confuse me if I was a soldier in World War I. It would make me question a lot of things. Things like, why am I here freezing and dying? And shooting at people I don't really have an issue with. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was a truce by the Entente and the Central Powers, more specifically on the Western Front, who climbed out of their trenches to shake hands and share a moment of peace on Christmas. The soldiers, for the most part, got along swimmingly. What's messed up is a few days later they were back at it again with blowing up and destroying each other. Personally, I don't know how you could do that after sharing a beer with somebody. Just doesn't make any sense.
Number 10. Nakano Takeko. A shrewd tactician and highly skilled warrior, Nakano was inspired from a young age by the stories of the famed Onimusha Tomoe Goza. Initially working to teach royal women how to use the naginata, a pole weapon that resembles a cross between a sword and a spear, Nakano would be embroiled within the Boshin War. This civil war saw the Tokugawa shogunate clash with imperial forces. Now, siding with the Tokugawa, she armed herself with a white weapon and gathered a group of women to fight alongside her. This group was dubbed the Joshitai, fighting independently from the main army due to discriminatory rules set by the officials. Famously, at a skirmish at Yanagi Bridge, the Joshitai faced down a squad of imperial troops who, when seeing that their enemies were women, were ordered not to shoot. This brilliant idea was followed up by Nakano easily dispatching between 5 and 6 soldiers single-handedly, the rest of the Joshitai dealing massive damage to the force. Number 9. Lady True. In 226, when Sun Quan sent soldiers to take control of the Jiaoji region, he couldn't have possibly predicted what he'd end up running into. Organizing a rebellion, Lady True gathered 1,000 followers with the goal of revolution. When her brother attempted to prevent her from doing this, Lady True said the coolest thing I've ever heard from a human being. I'd like to ride storms, kill orcas in the open sea, drive out the aggressors, conquer the country, undo the ties of serfdom, and never bend my back to be the concubine of whatever man. What happened from there isn't terribly well recorded, but it was stated that she fought from the back of a white elephant and may have also been 9 feet tall. That might be fictitious, but regardless, her name has become synonymous as a symbol of rebellion in Vietnam. Number 8. Queen Tuta. Bluntly, it's hard to find good accounts of Tuta's time as a queen, as both of the historians of the time were a little rude. Nevertheless, Queen Tuta rose to power after the death of Angron, becoming the Queen of Illyria. Securing her territory from rebellion, her army also happened to capture a Greek city on their return. Alongside this, Illyria was known for practicing piracy, which strained Greek and Roman trade. Ambassadors were sent to Illyria to negotiate with Tuta, who claimed that stopping the piracy would counter many long-held Illyrian beliefs. Now, one ambassador lost his temper, insulting Tuta to the point where she had them killed. Rome had its reason, and Illyria went to war. Unfortunately, the war was lost due to her forces being spread thin and the betrayal of a local governor. Number 7. Cynene. Born the half-sister of Alexander the Great, Cynene was a warrior princess who commanded the Macedonian armies with a skill second to none. She was recorded defeating an Illyrian queen and army, as well as the remnants of her half-brother's forces led by Alcitas. What little there is that is known of her reign, it is known that she plotted to marry her daughter to Philip Arrhidaeus, surrendering herself to Alcetus in order to delay the oncoming troops while her daughter was wed. Alcetus executed her, but she was so respected by his troops, the ones who had been her enemy, that they rioted against their commander, which fulfilled Cynene's final wishes. Her daughter, Eurydice, would become another famed warrior queen and be buried next to her mother. Number 6. Grace O'Malley. Born to the O'Malley clan in the 1500s, Grace O'Malley earned a fearsome reputation as the pirate queen. Head of the O'Malley clan, she began life as an extremely headstrong woman, one tale of her youth being that she was refused from one of her father's expeditions to Spain due to her long hair potentially getting caught in the ropes, to which she just responded by cutting off all her hair. She defeated clans Joyce and McMahon and became a menace to England, famed for meeting Queen Elizabeth I to negotiate the release of her captured sons. The tales of these negotiations are widespread and also really sick, like how she was caught in the palace with a dagger on her person, or how she was given a lace tissue to sneeze into, which she did, and then promptly tossed into a fireplace. In the end, she won her sons back and was given control of her land, employed as one of the world's first privateers under the crown.
Number 5. The Korean War. A war that is frankly just not talked about enough, and sadly I feel like the veterans don't get enough praise, so thank you. Now back to the mildly funny content. Korea was finding itself in quite a pickle, the same pickle that 40 other nations throughout the Cold War would find themselves in. Capitalism and communism were going to have a fight in their backyard, and it was going to be costly. Both sides supported their own not so nice dictator, and a bloody conflict ensued. Despite the UN and US efforts, and despite the Chinese and Soviet efforts, things kinda ended in the worst stalemate ever. As even today the tensions exist, Korea remains split in two by the ideologies. And North Korea is still a little crazy. Just a little bit. Number 4. Up and away. Back when history's second favorite mustache man, Joseph Stalin, was in charge, things were kind of oppressive. They were just really oppressive, actually. It was bad. Where were the Karens when we needed them to stand up to the actual oppression? When Germany was split into cool and not so cool Germany, the division between its citizens was becoming clear, and the people on the capitalist side were just living better, as life is better when you can walk into a German 7-Eleven and purchase a Slim Jim, cigarettes, Mountain Dew, and a reputable magazine with lewd centerfolds. You know the one. So Mustache Man, feeling confident after getting rid of history's favorite mustache man, blocked roads and trains from Berlin in hopes that the West would give in to his demands. And in pure teenage defiance, the West began to fly in supplies daily. 12,000 tons of goods daily. That's a lot of centerfolds, my guy. Number 3. The man who saved the world. Vasily Arkhipov. Not a name I reckon my humble bumblebees are familiar with. Well, why is this man so important? He's one of the reasons why you're not watching this video from the comfort of a concrete bunker. During the totally non-controversial Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Russian submarine with a Russian submarine commander. All Sean Connery jokes aside, the sub had nuclear capabilities. What's even scarier than that is due to some rising tensions and miscommunication, the bane of every good relationship, 3 out of 4 keys had been turned and were waiting on Vasily's response. Those were keys to launch nukes, by the way. Maybe it was his bleeding Russian heart, or his strong will to save mankind. Or it could have been nuclear radiation warping his brain and body due to a previous mishap on the sub. But regardless, he said nay, and the nuclear war was avoided. Thank goodness. I hope that never happens again. Whew. I think it happened again. Number 2. Broken Arrow. What is scarier than the uncertain destruction of society as we know it? And trust me, nuclear fire would be a bad way to go. I don't want to grow another third arm. The first one was difficult to get rid of. Well, how about not knowing at all where the bombs are? Sure, you wouldn't really see one until there was a mushroom cloud over your favorite vegan restaurant, and by then it would just be too late. But what I'm talking about is devices that got lost in the mail or just lost by the military. And yes, it's happened multiple times through the decades. One incident where a device was lost from a crashed plane and 3 out of the 4 safeties had been failed. That's a little too close for comfort. But of the declassified incidents the US is willing to tell you about, the Soviet Union has never said how many they lost. Just one of those comforting facts to keep both sides of your pillow warm at night. Начальник сказал, что не так. Number 1. Happy ending. There were tons of things to talk about during the Cold War. Seriously, you'd need a historian and a few textbooks to break everything down. However, when you boil down the main events, what was it really for? All that tension and stress. Nuclear war is just on the horizon. Years of arms racing and flinging people into the atmosphere faster than you can say, "Look out, Ukraine." A lot of things changed and a lot didn't. To me, it just seems like it's such a waste of money and time to have all those world enders collecting dust somewhere under an onion-shaped building. Russia has some onion-shaped buildings. I'm just assuming that's where they are. I'm hungry at this point. The point I'm making is, let's keep the nuking to the fat man and Fallout, the video game, not real life. Let's just be peaceful.
In 10th place, we have Unsinkable Sam. I thought I'd start off the list with something sort of fluffy, and what's better for that than a very good kitty? The black and white cat was originally named Oscar and started his career in the fleet of the Yahtzee regime, the Kriegsmarine, and ended it in the Royal Navy. He was on board the Bismarck, the HMS Cossack, and the HMS Ark Royal. All three of those ships had a single thing in common, and yep, they sank, and this kitty survived them all. Originally on the Bismarck, only 118 humans from its crew of over 2,200 survived. Little Oscar was found floating on a board and picked up from the water, the only survivor to be rescued by the British destroyer, HMS Cossack. For a few months, all went smoothly, until sadly the ship was hit by a torpedo, and once again the precious kitty was found clinging to a piece of plank. He made it through the ordeal and was brought to the shore establishment in Gibraltar. Unsinkable Sam was then adopted by the crew of the HMS Ark Royal, which ironically was a ship that was instrumental in sinking the Bismarck. Ark Royal survived several near misses and gained a reputation as a lucky ship, a fitting home for the lucky kitty. The Germans incorrectly reported the ship as sunk on multiple occasions, but the luck didn't last, and were returning from Malta on November 14th of 1941, this ship too was torpedoed. This time, Sam was found clinging to a floating plank by a motor launch and described as angry but unharmed. At this point, Sam had enough of sea life. He was transferred to a job on land and spent the rest of his days hunting mice in the building of the Governor General. In 9th place, time to visit the London Zoo. So in the late 30s, everyone sorta knew war was coming and prepared accordingly, and the London Zoo in particular was no exception. War broke out on September 3rd of 1939, and at precisely 11 a.m., the zoological gardens were closed by order of the government, as were all other public places where people gathered in large numbers. Zoo records show that some of the zoo's most valuable animals were transferred to Whipsnade for safety, including 2 giant pandas, 2 orangutans, 4 chimpanzees, 3 Asian elephants, and an ostrich. That's almost a Christmas carol. Here's the sad part though. All of the venomous animals were killed to remove the possibility of having dangerous animals escape the zoo if the zoo were, kaboomed. However, some reptiles were saved, among them the Komodo dragon and Chinese alligators. 2 large wooden boxes around 8 feet long by 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep were built to accommodate 2 huge pythons, one 28 feet long and the other 25 feet long. The most valuable fish were kept and housed in tubs and tanks in the tortoise house, where the glass was crisscrossed with sticky tape to prevent it from, well, shattering. In 8th place, we have Kasai's Castle. Sitting on a gorgeous wooded hilltop in Wałbrzych in southwest Poland, Kasai's Castle was seized by the Yahtzees from the Royals in 1941 as their evil leaders' future residence. A maze of tunnels and bunkers were built using forced labor from the nearby Gross Rosen concentration camp, but the complex was not completed at the end of the war. Some say that the complex was the headquarters of the Yahtzee Command. Others believe that the tunnels might have housed an arms factory or a nuclear weapons laboratory. Let me know in the comments what you think it would have housed. In 7th place, we have the Amber Room. The incredible Amber Room was considered to be the 8th wonder of the world and was a gift to Peter the Great to celebrate peace between Russia and Prussia in 1716. Try saying that 5 times fast. It was created in Prussia and the construction began in 1701, but when Peter saw the room and expressed his admiration, King Frederick William I offered it as a gift and had it shipped to St. Petersburg in 18 boxes. Tsarina Elizabeth moved the room again, this time to the Catherine Palace in Pushkin in 1755. The already impressive room was expanded and renovated, and when completed, it covered 55 square meters and contained approximately 13,000 pounds of amber and other valuables. The amber panels were adorned with gold leaf, and historians believe the room was worth about $400 million in today's money. When Schmittler initiated Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22nd of 1941, approximately 3 million soldiers entered the USSR. When the marauding German army entered Pushkin, the curators of the Catherine Palace desperately tried to disassemble and hide the precious amber room. But the Germans found it, tore it down within 36 hours, and shipped it to Kaliningrad in 27 crates. In late 1943, the curator of the museum where it was being held was told to dismantle the amber room yet again and store it elsewhere. The city was kaboomed by the Allies in August of 1944, and the whereabouts of the room are still unknown. Theories from historians vary, with one saying the museum curator didn't follow orders, so it was destroyed in the big kaboom, while another theory is that the amber was loaded onto a ship and is located at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Apparently there's a curse on the amber room as well, seeing as a number of people connected with it have met untimely deaths. The museum curator and his wife died from typhus, while a Russian intelligence officer died in a car crash immediately after talking about the amber room to a journalist. So if you never see me again, you know why. In 6th place we have a ghost plane. Couldn't help myself, had to talk about ghosties at some point today. Our tale takes place on December 8th of 1942, which was a year and a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. That was what brought the United States into, the war. The American Navy was on duty at Pearl Harbor when suddenly its radar picked up an odd reading. It seemed as if a lone plane was making its way from Japan and heading right into American airspace. It was late at night and the sky was overcast. Previous attacks had never occurred under those conditions. The radar operators were rightfully puzzled, but they sent 2 pilots to intercept the craft since they were not taking any chances. When they reached the plane, the pilots were shocked to find out that it was a P-40 with markings that hadn't been used since that attack. Once they got near the plane, they found that it had been shot to pieces and its landing gear was destroyed. They also saw the plane's pilot slumped over the cockpit with his suit stained by fresh red fluid. Incredibly, the pilot moved slightly, smiling and waving at the Americans. The plane plummeted to the ground and crashed in a field. When the 2 pilots investigated the crash site, they found the wreckage, but no sign of the pilot. The search team also found a diary that showed that the plane was stationed in Mindanao, approximately 1,300 miles away. The lack of landing gear made it an extremely difficult mystery to solve, and still has not been solved. How could a pilot survive the attack on Pearl Harbor for a year? Also, how did he manage to land and take off with no landing gear? I guess we'll never know.
Number 5. Helicopter War. Probably the most iconic iconography of the war is the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, or better known as the Huey. The Vietnam War was the first war to see extensive use of helicopters, and honestly, I'm not sure how Americans would have fought the war without them. One of the main reasons the Viet Cong were successful was because they knew the land, they knew the jungle, and used many tactics to their advantage. Oftentimes the jungle being their best weapon of defense itself. Even though chemicals and napalm were being used to help unjungle the jungle, it's the extensive use and effectiveness of the Huey helicopter that gave America the technological edge it so needed. For anyone that was actually there, I can just imagine the relief of soldiers that they must have felt when seeing those green beauties come barreling out of the sky. The helicopters turned out to be a great design and was used for many years after the Vietnam War. Number 4. Draft dodging. Grade 12, what a great time to be alive. You're about to graduate. All your friends are excited about spending one last summer together before everyone goes off to college. Maybe you'll spend some time down at the beach, go hang out at the mall, or maybe you'll find a summer fling at a summer party. Nice. And just as you were about to put those bell-bottom jeans on, your mom says you got a letter. Oh no. You just got drafted into the Vietnam War, and it looks like you'll be spending your summer looking for a guy named Charlie in the jungle. That's weird, I wonder where he is. This was a reality for many young Americans who found themselves looking at a piece of paper that either meant they could die in a jungle or be in trouble with the law. However, when option A and B suck, go for C. In this case, that was draft dodging. Americans who received the mandatory volunteer letter fled in decently large numbers to other countries so Uncle Sam couldn't have his way. Many ended up here in Canada. Number 3, Napalm Girl. I briefly touched on this in the last part, but Kim Fantee deserves a moment of her own. There's a picture that made it out of the Vietnam War known as Napalm Girl. Well, Kim is that girl. Again, we cannot show you the image due to its graphic nature, but it's basically screaming Vietnamese children running down the road after a napalm strike near their location. Unfortunately for Kim, she was an innocent victim of total war. Her clothes were burned off and her skin was severely damaged by napalm, leaving her with scars and reminders of a horrible past. Almost 50 years later, she's still around to tell the story, and how she used faith and forgiveness to forgive those that caused so much pain and destruction to her country and herself. The photograph of Kim is probably the most infamous image of the war, and maybe the 20th century, and is a part of the media coverage that helped inspire Americans to pull out of the war. Number 2. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Good old Tricky Dick had just become president, and he had a plan to end the war in Vietnam, but first, they had to invade Cambodia. Why Cambodia? Well, basically the Viet Cong had this genius idea of moving war goods, materials, and troops on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but also moving through Cambodia, which at the time was neutral. The US just wasn't looking there at first. However, when it was realized it would be a tactical good decision to stop that from happening, for poor Tricky Dick, the invasion of Cambodia felt like he was furthering the war rather than trying to bring it to a close. To make matters worse, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, and it was discovered that America had increased involvement and not decreased. The people had had enough, and anti-war movements sparked across the country. It wasn't too long after this that they pulled out of Vietnam. And Cambodia. Number 1. The music. A lot can be said about the Vietnam War, but if sitting through history classes and watching some old movies doesn't paint the picture, then sit down and have a listen to the music that was made during the conflict. A lot to do with counterculture at the time. Once the Vietnam War went into second gear, art began to have its take on the Far East conflict. Books, movies, plays, but nothing more reachable and mainstream as music. The Doors, Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and the classic CCR. If your thoughts of Vietnam don't feature Fortunate Son by CCR, is it really a thought about Vietnam? I say no. This is kind of disturbing, as when you compare it to music one decade prior, it's completely different. Despite baby boomers causing havoc on minimum wage retail workers today, their music is pretty good and does a good job of depicting the emotions felt in such a grim situation.